Hello, everyone. My name's Kimia, and I'm going to be your host for this episode. We have Liz from Stage 2 Capital. Liz, why don't you give us a quick overview of your background? You've been in sales operations for a very long time, and give us the overview, and then we can dive in.
Awesome. Well, first, thanks for having me. Fun to be here today. So, my name is Liz Christo. I'm a partner at Stage 2 Capital, where I invest in seed and A round B2B software companies. If I wind way back, started my career working for a very small startup that got acquired into a public company. Spent about 8 years at NetSuite, building out different parts of go to market across sales operations, account management, and then top of funnel. And that was a really fun run. We got to sell like in every country across every deal size and every vertical, like a true horizontal product when you think about selling like GL and ERP to CFOs. And when I left NetSuite, I joined the dark side and went into venture. And I spent about 6 years at OpenView Venture Partners. Very similar thesis around B2B software companies. And the transition to Stage 2 for me was really an opportunity to work both slightly earlier in the life cycle of a company and then also a little bit earlier in the life cycle of a firm and really kind of get to put a stamp on building Stage 2 Capital.
I love it. The topic and the theme of this seasons of the podcast is recession-proof. And so what I'm very curious, because you have such an extensive history across a ton of different sales topics, is what's different now that you see companies doing really well versus, call it 5 years ago or so? Where are companies succeeding?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you first like posed this question and this idea as we were prepping, I started thinking about what would I do different in a recession? And it's weird because I think a lot of the like frameworks and the way we think about building a business at Stage 2 Capital actually is very similar regardless of market conditions. And part of that comes back to if you go to our website and look at the science of scaling, we have this idea that there is like the very basics of building a business. And it starts with actually like identifying what your leading indicators are. And so most businesses are like tracking revenue and lagging indicators like results and output of activity. And we try to like gear everybody to thinking a bit earlier than that. So rather than waiting to see if your largest customer renews 12 months from now, what are the things we can track now to understand whether that client is happy, engaging with your product, activated in the way you expect? Because if we see those signals, we can anticipate with like pretty good certainty that they'll renew. So I bring that example up because I think a lot of the ways we think about building a business come back to those like fundamentals. So, when I like broadly look at the market right now, I think a lot of businesses are doing just that and coming back to the basics and shoring up their existing customer base and really making sure that they have really good clarity on what renewals are coming in, which customers are expanding or contracting. They're probably reorienting resources to make sure that that existing revenue will be there. And then secondly, when it comes to like selling new customers, I think that there's a real focus on ICP now, probably more than ever as we're staring down the start of a recession. Like it's really important that we are spending our time on the deals that have the highest likelihood of closing. So that's kind of like the highest level of what I see. And I think like as I think about sales leaders generally, that piece holds true. You should be selling the deals that are most likely to close, that'll work through your process the fastest, that will actually like give each of your team members a chance to hit quota, and removing a lot of those distractions and shiny objects that have become normalized for some companies, I think is a really good thing to be doing right now.
It's interesting that you say remove the distractions, because one thing that I think we've seen a lot in the past little while is just try a bunch of things, experiment on everything, and now it's really a question of focus. I'm curious if you've seen experimentation work in a downtime or a recession. How should sales leaders be thinking about, should we explore this topic, or should we just focus, ride out the wave, and then make sure we have a strong revenue base going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I always think people should be experimenting, but it's like a question and trade-off of resources. So in my mind, like the shift that's occurring is a lot of companies are stopping thinking about growth at all costs. And so you're doing the work first to understand like what is the basis that you have? What are these proven routes to revenue? How can we exploit them? And then any incremental time, resources, energy, money you have can be pointed at experimentation. I mean, it's kind of funny if you think about like a business or a startup just in terms of survival. In a bull market, it looks very different than a bear market. In a bull market, it's like the first to get to a big round, who can create a category or create that like beachhead first, who can build the platform, who can make the most noise and have this like community engagement. And then when you flip that on its head and you think about survival in a bear market, different things matter. It's no longer about raising the big ground. It's like cash is king. Like who has the longest runway, who has the highest customer retention, who can actually do this work to revert to like the proven methodologies that work. So I think if I put that as like the baseline and the setup for that, then experimentation becomes pretty fun. It becomes like, how do we actually find the next lever of growth we can pull? And how do we do that in a way that is like really clearly defined, that we know what results we're looking for, we know what we're going to spend, we know what hypothesis we're testing. I think it comes back to being like way more thoughtful in our experimentation and like following experimentation frameworks, as opposed to like often I hear like, we're just going to try these 5 things, and you get to the end of the quarter, there's no like correlation or causation. It's just like, yeah, probably something worked because we started growing.
Right. Do you have a framework for that experimentation? I'm curious, like if you were to give maybe an example of one of the portfolio companies that
Yeah.
you've worked with, who's doing experimentation right? How have you advised them on this?
Yeah, I think there's experimentation like all different kinds. So obviously it depends first on, we're talking about go to market, but like it depends on your go to market model. So if you are a self-serve, bottoms up, product led business, the type of experimentation you're doing probably looks very different than if we're talking about somebody who's like doing an outbound motion. And we can talk about examples of each of them. But in both cases, I think the commonality and like the framework that comes back to is very clearly defining the experiment. Like, what is the hypothesis you are testing? How long does the experiment need to run? Will like N be big enough to give us an answer? And what are the results we're looking for that help us make a decision? And that last one, I think, is one like people fail to do often. You might set up an experiment and then you like wait and reflect on it 2 weeks, 30 days, 60 days later. But if you don't know what outcome was going to lead to what decision, I find this like justification thing happens where it's like, well, we thought maybe we'd get a little more uplift, but you know, it was like 1.5%. That's pretty good. We can put more resources behind it. So like you didn't really scope something to make a decision. You just
Yeah.
like kind of tested generically. So I don't know, let me give an example. One of the things that I think we test a lot is like how to most effectively build outbound lists.
Right.
And there's a lot of ways to do that. You can go out to a vendor and buy a list. You can have your SDRs building them yourself. You can hire an intern to do research. You can turn on a piece of software to help you aggregate those lists. You can buy LinkedIn Sales Navigator and do searches and download those and export them. You can hire an offshore team to do list building and contact building for you. So I think the question then becomes like, how targeted should you be? And what's the return on each of those relative to the cost? So ways that I've done that in the past is say, we're going to create 5 or 6 different lists and we're going to treat them the same way. And we're going to see what the cost of acquiring a lead and opportunity in a customer is. So we're tracking conversion on each of those lists. So that means you go out to a vendor and you buy 1,000 contacts. You pull 1,000 person list out of LinkedIn, you augment it with Clearbit and you try that. You go and spin up a team offshore and have them build a list with like very like defined parameters. And then you track what happens to each of those accounts if you put them through the same cadence and you allocate the same amount of man hours to them. And the output of that should be a spreadsheet that shows you like row by row, how many leads, opportunities, and customers did I get? And what was the cost of each of those? Which you can decide whether you want to include like hours and overhead in it. But like you can have a fully loaded cost of acquiring that lead. And so that's I would say like probably much more sophisticated way of testing outbound than most people do. I think generally what I see is like we hired 1 or 2 SDRs, go. But like that's an example of something that you might try during this time in particular, like refine a list and say, we're going to go after this really hyper segmented part of the market, a subset of our ICP, and let's see like how efficiently we can start acquiring those customers.
How do you think about ending experiments? I think your advice on setting up an experiment and saying we need to clearly define what the outcome here is and what success looks like. There are a lot of companies that we've seen run an experiment probably for too long.
Yeah.
Is it just intellectual honesty? How do you think about advising companies on, look, this clearly isn't working, we need to test something else?
I mean, I think you start with a hypothesis and like you time bound it. So you try to know how long it's going to take or how many data points you need to make a decision. So if you start with that, you should have some idea. Obviously, if it's going terribly, like let's talk about like A/B testing on a website and your plan was to like run it A/B for like 3 days or a week and 4 hours in, you're seeing like, okay, the conversion rates are 50% less than they're supposed to be. Like, call it, right? Like
End it
bad
right there.
hypothesis, restart.
Totally.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think you should be monitoring along the way, but it does matter how many data points you're looking for. And so, if that example I just gave, two website visitors came and only one of them converted, and that's 50%, like that's very different than if 1,000 people passed through, right? So I think it comes down more to the data you're trying to gather than necessarily just the time. Um, I don't know. There's a lot of other kinds of experiments people can run in a business. I think one of the examples I give pretty frequently is around sales compensation. One of the companies in our portfolio, QuotaPath, is sales commission planning software. And AJ, the CEO, and I just gave a talk at SaaStr, and we were talking about like the ways you can test sales comp. And I think people often think of spiffs or like sales performance incentives as ways to create this like new behavior, but it's also a great way to test changes to your comp plan. So like an example in like a recession where cash is king, what if you ran a spiff to see if you could get your entire sales team oriented around collecting cash faster? You might pay a point or two more in commissions if somebody's willing to pay an annual contract up front rather than pay monthly or quarterly. You could run that as a spiff for a month to see if you can change the behavior. And if it's working, then you can roll it out as an official plan. Like that's a totally different kind of experiment you might consider doing in a business to drive like the behavior you need at this point.
I mean, QuotaPath you just mentioned. I think one of the interesting things too is you're seeing the enablement of these platforms to drive experimentation, and so you can much more quickly iterate and test on incentives. I'm curious on the topic of incentives. What else have you seen work? What should our companies that are listening to this think about? Okay, I'm just gearing up my sales team. A basic incentive plan versus a more complex incentive plan. Is there an 80-20 there?
Okay, I'm going to plug QuotaPath again because they just did a launch on October 4th where they released what they're calling Compensation Hub, which is like, I'm calling it like a sandbox or playground for sales comp, which is literally like you can design plans, you can see what's being most commonly used, and like you can test them. But with input to that, what I generally see is like plans are pretty consistent. It starts by like, what is the business behavior that we are trying to drive? And that is really dependent on like the stage and type of business. And then from there, it's like one or two things that drive compensation to try to keep a plan simple. And I'm giving best practices now. And then really clear like how someone gets paid out. So as an example, if your like key metric is like land and expand, I'm sorry, that's not a metric. If your key business motion is trying to land and expand, like
Totally.
your goal is to grow customers over time, you need to incentivize like landing logos, but probably more importantly, like what happens to those customers over the first 6 to 12 months. So your comp plan probably has two things. It's oriented around new logos brought in the door, and 25 to 50% of your comp is tied to that, or variable comp. And the other part of it is tied to the revenue from expansion over time. Now, another example, let's say like you have a company who is really trying to juice the number of logos. They actually don't care about revenue right now. It's a land grab and you're in a competitive market. You literally might just pay your team on logo acquisition regardless of the amount of revenue attached to that logo. That looks really different. So I'm giving out
Totally.
some random examples here, but I think what it comes down to is comp plans should be really simple, really easy to understand, and probably even more so in a period of a recession, making it really clear how people make money and that they're in control of how they make money. I always think of this quote, and I don't even know if it's really a quote, but the great thing about salespeople is they do what you pay them to do. The terrible thing
Right.
about salespeople is they do what you pay them to do. And so if you put it in that context, like your comp plan can drive a lot of behavioral change. It's like one of the key levers in your go-to-market motion. And I do feel like way too often it's just like kind of a set it and forget it. And like we look at it once a year and update it. And I don't know, there's a lot more work that could go into that to drive like great behavior and then also to like create change in a period like, this year where there's just a lot of turbulence in the markets. Our comp plans can be driving a lot more adjustments along the way.
To pull this recession-proofing thread a little bit further,
Yeah.
have you seen a change in compensation plans from, call it, 5-6 years ago in bull times versus now in bear times? Or is it really just boils down to best practices of simple, your reps understand it, it's very clear, and you have that outcome around experimentation on the thing that you're trying to drive?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a change, but I will say I've seen like a much bigger conversation around how to keep high performers. And I do think it comes back to those best practices. Like if somebody understands how they get paid, and when they close a deal, they can literally look at it and understand what they're going to make. It is like way more important than like the super complex plan. Like keeping it simple allows somebody to understand that. So I am seeing more conversation around that now, that like comp plans are really important, that you want to be making sure that your top performers, who generally in most companies are driving like a significant portion of the revenue, it's not evenly distributed, that they're happy, that they understand how they're going to get paid, that they're not making less money year over year. I think probably more than ever, like turnover is really scary to a business, particularly if you're running on a lean team, or that person's carrying a lot of the revenue for the company. You got to make sure that they're actually incentivized to keep doing it.
It's a good segue into what I wanted to talk to you about team structure. How do you
Yeah.
advise companies going from founder-led sales to building up a sales team? Because I think there's two components to this. One is, can you scale the actual sale? So
Yeah.
getting good reps in place who can carry a quota. And then the other layer to this is sales infrastructure, which I actually think is often overlooked. And this is something that we were talking about before, and a lot of the thing that you advise companies on doing. So I'd love for you to touch on, someone's going through founder-led sales. What are the things they should be thinking about as they scale up their team, both the operations and the actual go-to-market sales side?
Yeah. I mean, look, let's start with the people, because that's like far and away the most important part. And I think one of the expectations that I often see that's just misguided is like a founder thinks you can hire a killer sales rep and like that suddenly is going to make you have product market fit. And like that is not the case. So instead, I like try to encourage people to look at that first seller as a partner in figuring this out. This is not a handoff of the sales process. This is somebody that like you are going to work with to figure out how this motion can become repeatable. The thing that works for you as a founder in telling your story is generally like you're very intertwined with the story and the sale, and like that has to get removed, and somebody almost has to cleanse it to a way that other people can tell the story. I think that's a lot of what happens with that first hire. So when I like think about the first hire in a business, the first sales hire, sorry, the first go to market hire, it's a mix of things, but we often look for somebody who can play like a little bit of everything. They need to be able to do some prospecting. They need to be able to close new business. They need to probably be able to do a little bit of the CS work. They might do a little bit of that like early process building, the very early stuff. And it needs to be somebody who's a bit of a jack of all trades. Like it is not somebody that comes from a 20-year enterprise selling experience at a big company. Like they have to be quite scrappy and willing to like try and do a lot of different things over time. And then the other thing that I look for is somebody who's just a really avid learner and like kind of groks the product. They're going to be the tightest feedback loop between the customer and the like early product team, and making sure that like everyone has access to understand like what are we hearing from the customer, what's resonating in our message, what's not, how are we iterating, what are we learning from those over time. A person needs to be like very open to doing that. I think a lot of salespeople get very like heads down in their own process, and that's not a bad thing. I just don't think it's a fit for like the first hire. Those are some of the things I look for when we get started. And we've written a couple of like kind of white papers on this topic of hiring your first sales leader too, because there's this mix of like, should your first hire be the leader, the person who's going to hire under them? Should it be a seller and then you like layer them in the future? And there's different ways that that works for different businesses. But I would say my overarching commentary, particularly in this time, is to hire the person you need right now and for the next year. And generally that's going to be a seller first. And then over time, you add additional sellers or you add the VP of sales. But the skill set to be a head of sales or a sales manager looks really different than the person who's willing to like go out there and prospect and do CS and do a lot of this work that I just described. So I think keeping the scope really refined is important too. So it's kind of like the people side on that first hire. And certainly we could talk about more of the team around them of RevOps and CS and what order to hire in. But like maybe before we get to that, we'll kind of tackle some of the operational stuff too. We wrote something called the go-to-market checklist, but our concept is basically like you need to start documenting what's working. So if you are expecting a new hire to get on the phone and do a qualification, do a discovery call, do a demo, like what's the script? And
Right.
I don't mean that this needs to be something that you follow like top to bottom perfectly, have it memorized, but man, there should be some pretty clear direction in like what works and what doesn't, and what we've learned over time. And I think it's like, it's sad to me when I look at a team who's got, 5 to 10 reps and everybody's doing something a little different and there aren't those like shared collective learnings. that sales playbook should be iterative and like constantly evolving as you learn. That takes somebody actually like kind of driving that and like making sure that that's part of the culture. Yeah. So let me pause there. I mean, that was like a
No,
lot
no,
to unpack. Does that like start to answer?
that's fantastic. No, I think that's great. One of the things that stands out to me is, and this is a very, I'm sure you've heard this plenty of times, this is a very classic, great salespeople don't make great sales managers.
Yeah.
And if you turn your great sales manager or a great salesperson into a sales manager, everything often goes like really bad. And thinking about how that actually breaks down, I think that makes a lot of sense. What I'm curious as well on the sales side is, what do you think teams get wrong building out their operations? What can people avoid to not make
Yeah.
mistakes around scaling up?
Okay, I have to go back for 1 second before
Of
we do that
course,
because, like,
please.
generally, I'd say 90% of the time I agree with you on that. But the funny thing about the sales rep to sales manager thing is like, no one's a manager until they're a manager. And so, like,
That's
how
very
do you
true.
know? And so,
Yes,
one of the things I struggle with in that is like, I think there are unbelievable sales managers who are currently sales reps and they need the like chance to grow into that. And so, I think it is situational. And what I would like encourage people to look at is like, what are the motivations for someone to make that leap? And I do think there is this odd like mentality that your career and promotion cycle is tied to like becoming a manager and then a senior manager and a VP. I don't want to sit there being like, I had reps working for me that made so much more money than I did when I was like a director. So like,
totally.
shouldn't we like also like just shine a light on the fact that that is like an unbelievable career path? So anyway, motivators.
No,
All right,
I think it's right.
coming back to the operational side, some of the mistakes I see people make. Man, I'm going to use myself as an example. I was a like customer support associate that got promoted into a sales ops job. And you know what I knew about sales ops when I was like 22? Like, yeah, we usually take smart people and throw them into jobs and like let them learn on the fly. But I think that's actually like super dangerous to an early stage startup because the person and then the people surrounding them often don't know what they don't know. And so I think there's like a ton of value in finding either advisors, consultants, or outsourcing some portion of this to bring best practices into the mix. So if you have, you know, a one person who sort of like ops for the company, probably, right? I'm not even going to say rev ops. It's just generally like that early jack of all trades, chief of staff type person who like good enough at most of these things. Supplement them with somebody who can spend 10 to 20 hours a month showing them best practices, making sure that like as they're thinking about the setup of your CRM, that they know the difference between creating custom fields and workflows and how that's going to feed reporting in the future. Because these foundational things you do are going to be with you for a long time. And it's really painful to redo them when you have like years of data sitting in like this kind of dysfunctional setup. So that's like one system side. And then I think the second thing is like figuring out how to automate as much as you can and taking the time on a regular basis to look at how your people are spending their time. I think it's really easy to get lost. Not lost. I think it's always with the best of intentions. We keep layering more work onto people. And, you know, we went from, give an example, like a sales team who had very limited tech. And then it was like, we're going to add in Sales Loft or Outreach, and we're going to give them a video tool. And then we're going to give them a prospecting tool. And then we're going to give everybody licenses to like this email finder. And suddenly you look at like how your sales team's spending their day, and there's like 18 things they have to log into, and everybody's kind of doing it their own way. And it kind of needs an audit. So I think there's this like ability within a startup to take a step back every month or two and just say, what's a day in the life look like? And are there like more efficient ways we could do that? At some point, like it's probably better to have someone else build that list and give it to your sales team, or to help them think about how to structure their day so they don't have 18 tabs open all the time, or to put call blocks on everyone's calendar. I'm throwing random examples out, but like
Totally.
this concept of like, look at what everybody's spending their time on and figure out if there are ways you can get that off their plates. Actually, I have a really good one for him today. I was
Please.
working with a company who has all their leads dropping into Slack every time somebody converts. And in theory, that's like, okay, it's a really quick time to getting it. And that worked really well when there were 2 sales reps. But now there's 12. So 12 people get an alert every time there's a lead. And they all go try to click it. But like the first person claims it. And now just 11 other people clicked a link and got disrupted from whatever they were doing. That's not
Hugely
anyone's time.
inefficient.
Yeah.
Yeah, of
But like
course.
things like that exist just throughout the entire process. And I it's hard to make the time, but that zoom out of just giving yourself space to figure out what are the big picture things that we can change for people on a regular basis, I think matters a lot. And then my very last one on operationally is just like get the data infrastructure right from the beginning. If you keep changing your sales stages or you keep changing how you store data and it like continues to evolve, it's really hard to end up with any historicals. Like you are just constantly mapping data. And so thinking really like carefully from the get-go about what are you trying to report on, what like behaviors are you trying to drive, what are our North Star metrics, and like can we report on those things, not trying to create this like crazy burden for anybody to be putting in information in that way. Like be thoughtful about what you can get, but make sure you're setting it up so it can scale.
Do you have any common markers, and maybe recession proofing delays how you think about rev ops? At the early stages, it's get someone who can just spend 10 hours to support. Maybe it's an advisor, or maybe it's someone
Yep.
internal who is a very smart 22-year-old who knows nothing about sales ops but can figure stuff out. What are the markers where you're like, okay, I know I need to get someone who actually knows what they're doing and bring in experience? Is it just a repeated sales cycle? I'm curious what your best practices and what you're seeing is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it depends on the sales leader and the team a lot. So as I look at like the leaders that like I work with, there are sales leaders who are like really unbelievable, like the yay rah rah rally the troops, big personality. There are people who have like really great deal insights and are almost like that super rep riding along. And there are like really operationally and data focused leaders. And I call that out because I think depending on who you've hired, there's not a wrong hire here. They need a very different team around them. And so that does matter. But I do think in any of those cases, a RevOps person getting hired earlier in the life cycle of a business is something I'm definitely advocating for more and more. And I do say RevOps intentionally, like siloing this to sales ops and then having to hire like ops people in every department, I don't think is like the right move. But somebody who could sit across the entire revenue function, maybe even like partner with finance, which is the most likely scenario to do that, I think it's really compelling. So I generally see it as like while you're trying to find product market fit, you're in this stage of like jack of all trades, maybe doing some outsourcing to get initial stuff set up. As you're moving from product market fit to go to market fit and really thinking about how do I scale this motion that worked, that's when I start to see people bring somebody in house and then start to supplement with either contractors or external. So, as an example, if you're bringing in somebody who's going to focus on owning the tech stack, who's going to own like your data analysis, who's probably going to own your forecast, some of your renewals process, who's going to own the SKUs you're selling and your pricing, whatever. There's lots of different things they could own. They're probably not also going to be your Salesforce admin or like no Apex. So like we need to get them some help there. That doesn't mean another full-time body. That means again, like a bucket of hours they can probably call on. And then I think you start to build out around that person. And I think that tipping point's much harder to just say like objectively. I think that that comes with like the ratios and how the sales model is being built and capacity.
That makes a lot of sense. To switch gears a bit, we've been talking about things are great. You're scaling up. What is the infrastructure you need? I'm curious what you advise people when times are rocky. So things aren't going well, things are maybe breaking. What are some of the first few things you do when you drop into an organization where it's like, we're just not closing deals or things are just not working and we need help or restructuring our process? And maybe it's due to the recession, maybe it's not, but I'm curious what you advise companies.
I mean, they're probably pretty similar. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I think about is ICP. So
Right.
like, do you know who your ideal customer is, what the qualities are? Can you identify them consistently? And then how many of your customers fit that? Does your pipeline fit that? And why does like half of your pipeline not look like the ICP you just told me? Like throw it out and stop spending time on it. So that's like the first one to me. And then I think one of the things I'll just call out as we talk about a recession versus not is you probably spent the last couple of years like figuring out your ideal message for your ideal customer, and that might become irrelevant overnight. So messaging becomes really important. I don't know, like I was trying to think about an example of this, and I was struggling a bit because I mean, there's so many, but like, let's take a company like everybody knows, like Gong. If we're Gong in 2020, like I'm out there pitching, you're going to hire 50 people this year. Like, how do you make sure they're all great? Like, how your sales managers can't keep up. They need a more efficient way to do this. Gong 2022, I may not be putting on my website, but I think what I'm thinking is like, you just reduced your sales team by 20%, but you still need to grow. How do you do more with less? Like, your message totally changes. So I give that example because I think there's this like alignment between ICP and messaging that needs to happen. Whether things are going poorly, whether it's market, it doesn't really matter. But it's really like getting back to the basics. Are we selling to the right people? Are we meeting at the right point in the buyer journey? And are we saying the right things to them? You can't convince somebody to buy your product. Like nobody
Of
like
course.
accidentally stumbled into this demo. So like you're there to help them figure out if this is a fit. And that I think comes back to the messaging of, are you a vitamin or a painkiller, to use the like terrible old analogy, but there are different ways to package that same product you have, and that message might need to iterate quickly, both on your website, in your conversations, on your demos. And that's a big product marketing and sales enablement initiative to get that done.
I'd love to drill into messaging because I think
Yeah.
so. You've described a lot of the sales. It's interesting because I was doing a little bit of reading prior to this, and your approach is very Moneyball to sales, scientific. You can build it. It's a repeatable playbook. I think a lot of founders maybe struggle with what the art of messaging is. Is
Mm-hmm.
there any just tactical, maybe strategic? What would you advise companies on messaging outside of maybe just the obvious listening to your customers and building around that ICP? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Hire someone. I know that's terrible and it's not a good answer, but like I think about all the things I work on and go to market, and like I don't think that's a skill of mine. And I admire those where it is. I think I have like can help distill down like the value and understand what the real value proposition is. And I think you can do that by having calls with customers and looking at the data, but then packaging that up in a way that's ready to be slapped on a website. Ooh, not my skill set. But I do think it's actually a really like astute comment. I think people struggle with that. And my job is literally looking at websites all day. Like, right, I'm BDR who's trying to find the next deal we want to do.
Right.
And I am shocked sometimes between like what I hear from a founder in a conversation or talking to their customers and then like what's reflected on the website. Like, there's great marketers out there who can help you do that. And like, I would employ them to help. But yeah, in like the really early days, if you're not willing to spend the money or you can't do that right now, I do think actually like listening to your customers and understanding how they describe your product is pretty key. I'll tell you, it's actually something we do a lot in venture too. Like when I'm in diligence, like one of the things I'm listening for as I talk to customers and I'm in customer calls is like, are they using your product for the same thing? And often what you'll find in the early days is like you are going to market with this message of like what you are solving. And then your customers have kind of like hacked it into like five different things. And like, what is the repeatable thing? What are people actually leaning into? What's resonating? And can you pull from that? And then I guess the last piece is this example I gave of like, are you in a market where it's super competitive, where you're trying to save people time, money, efficiency? Like, how are you talking about this so somebody can start to build the ROI story in their head?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting too because on the comment of VC, you are selling the hardest thing, where it's broadly capital, and with stage two, it's very. I mentioned this before the call, before we started recording, but when I was building Buyer prior to the Ramp acquisition, like I wish I had go to market expertise and the resources and experience. I'm curious, outside of maybe hiring contractors for leverage, there's a lot of, you mentioned the white papers, there's a lot of just resources and information out there. One of the things that I read in Amp It Up, the Frank Slootman book,
Mm-hmm.
is playbooks change and playbooks are contextual. What resources do you find you keep coming back to that you're like, this is timeless? More people need to read this. And maybe it's some of your own work, maybe it's some other work, but I'm curious because
Yeah.
you hear playbooks get thrown out all the time.
There's a couple. The first one is ours, The Science of Scaling. I would absolutely recommend that people go read it. It's like a 20-page white paper on the front of our website. But everything I'm talking about, whether it is a recession or not, it's the fundamentals of building an efficient business. And I think we've moved from this place of go hire 10 more sales reps and like hope to like we can actually like look at the numbers to indicate like how many sales reps we can like feed this quarter. Do we have enough leads? Will they be productive? And we can try to make this a bit more scientific. So that would start there. The second thing that I've come back to just like time and time again in my career is the book Who. And it is a hiring book, The Art of Hiring A Players. And it's all of this that we're talking about starts with people. And that to me, that methodology of just thinking about how to hire and what to interview for and how deep to go continues to really resonate with me. I loved it when I read it 10 years ago and I keep coming back to it now. I mean, I would start with those. I think there's lots of other things because you're right. Like playbooks are not, they're not forever. And I do think the context matters a lot, but those are two that I like return to often.
No, I think those, I've never heard of Who, so I'm going to check out Who as
Check it
well.
out.
I will. The other thing I hear a lot is, what general advice would you, and by the way, I've been chatting to you a lot about just advice, but it's what general advice would you give? I find the best advice is I've tried these 5 things. These haven't worked. How should I think about this? Right. And I think most things boil down to it's a contextual problem because every company is different. We've covered a lot of ground. And Liz, thank you so much for the time. My final question to you, given the theme of recession proof, is what are you optimistic about?
Oh, I'm so optimistic about the companies being built right now. And it's funny, like I mean, we've probably talked about this a lot generally in the market, but there is a whole group of founders who are starting out right now who are going to have this like much harder time getting started. And that means they're going to be like super scrappy. They're going to be really thoughtful about their resources. The ideas are going to be great and they're going to build these like unbelievable businesses. And you look back and like, on repeat, great businesses have come out of these periods. And so I think the resiliency that founders are going to build and the ideas I'm just seeing right now, like I am very, very excited about the startup software market as a whole. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening.
Fantastic. Liz, I think that's a great place to close. Thank you so much again for the time. This has been a lot of
You
fun.
too.
And I'm sure the audience will get a ton of value out of this. We'll drop the resources in the show notes below as well. So thank you again.